Welcome and thanks for your interest in the pedagogical aspects of Ecomedia. I'm Antonio Lopez and I'm recording this from my office in Rome, Italy. I'm suffering a bit from current environmental conditions, so please forgive me for sounding a bit stuffed up. Before we get into my presentation, I want to give you a general outline of what I will be covering. The first three sections explore the history, context, and evolution of my conceptual thinking. It helps explain the design behind the Mediasphere heuristic. The most important part of this presentation is when I discuss the Mediasphere, so you might want to skip ahead if you only have a short amount of time. Let's get started. I want to begin with a story. When I was 15, I was a punk kid in LA making fanzines. My zine was called Ink Disease. As part of a high school program for 3 weeks, I got to live with a Hopi family in the southwestern part of the United States in Arizona. The family elder was Thomas Menachia, who shared with me a story about when the Hopi first came into contact with the Spanish. As was practiced at the time, the conquistadores marched with a cross-bearing clergy leading the way. Not familiar with the story of Christianity or the symbolism of the crucifixion, the Hopi did what we could call today a Gestalt visual reading of the cross. They interpreted the Spanish symbol to mean that they were good engineers and angular thinkers, but they were worried. Because it lacked a circle, which represents the natural cycles and continuity of life, they were worried that the Spanish cosmology would be unsustainable and dangerous. A common symbol of North American First Nations is the medicine wheel, which is an encircled cross. Among many things, it symbolizes the cycle of life, four directions, and interconnectivity, all of which the Hopi foresaw as lacking in the colonizer worldview. For many First Nations, the medicine wheel is a complex cosmological map and navigation tool. I should state clearly that I am not authorized to teach or study the medicine wheel. I share this story only because it is a source and inspiration for the model for shifting my perspective on how to teach Ecomedia and the Ecomediasphere. I would like to relate the story of the cross and the circle to how we conceive of media. As you can see in this table, in terms of our ecological crisis, I correlate the Gestalt reading of the cross with modernity. I tie our future to ancient wisdom on the right side, proposing that putting the cross back into the circle helps build connections, relationships, and systems across time and space. The Mediasphere is an effort to shift from the concepts in the left column to those on the right. So, for example, transitioning from mechanism to ecology and systems, from Cartesian space to acoustic space, from the concept of progress and growth to ecological limits and climate disruption, from democracy to earth democracy, autonomy and individualism to interdependence, from a view of economics that is disembedded from living systems to a view of economics embedded within living ecosystems, transforming from a concept of media to ecomedia, from mass media to media ecosystems, from a transmission model of communication to one based on participation and sharing, from the idea of a media text to an ecomedia object, from the concept of knowledge construction to ecological intelligence, and from left brain hemisphere dominant thinking to right brain emergent. About 20 years ago, I started teaching media literacy. I mainly worked with Native American tribes in New Mexico. When it came to the needs of the communities, increasingly I found a conflict of worldviews between conventional media literacy and media studies. Mainly, it was difficult to find resources related to environmental issues and ecology, and it just felt like media education was disconnected from the reality of Native Americans. Subsequently, I did a deep dive into media literacy practices of North American media literacy organizations, which is covered extensively in my last book, Greening Media Education. My conclusions can be summarized as follows. Standard media literacy practices are primarily based on 19th century thinking and a paradigm of modernity. It reinforces mechanism and progress. They focus on reflective practices, are primarily anthropocentric. They tend to discuss and analyze primarily visual and mass media. There's an abundant use of container and conduit metaphors. Media economics are usually thought of as disembodied from the environment. And there's focus on individual autonomy, individualism, and last but not least, their approaches tend to be apolitical because they're trying to fit within the mainstream of education standards. Most importantly, I found pervasive root metaphors tied to mechanism, progress, and individualism. The education theorist Chet Bowers argues that root metaphors are how the past colonizes the present. Metaphors become interpretive frameworks for taken for granted beliefs. Through language, the cross continues to colonize our thinking about media education. As it relates to teaching ecomedia, my studies showed that many important modes of inquiry are excluded, including the concept of affect, medium, political economy, or systems approach to thinking, ecology in general, and also, more generally, alternative media. But I did find a point of intervention, which is the use of spatial metaphors such as navigation, which can support the introduction of ecosystem metaphors to help map media. Thus, in my redesign, efforts to encourage ecological thinking, I'm trying to use ecological metaphors whenever appropriate in order to reframe our thinking about media. However, very importantly, ecological metaphors are not a substitute for ecological thinking, nor do they determine ecological ways of perceiving, i.e., the common use of terms like media ecology, iPhone ecosystem, or Facebook ecosystem are incomplete metaphors. The method of analysis has to consciously extend the metaphor to actual practice and facilitate understanding of ecological issues. Which brings us to the Ecomediasphere. In Greening Media Education, I started to model this as the media wheel, but I'm revising it to reflect a more holistic perspective that a sphere metaphor implies. I'm drawing inspiration for my design from the iceberg model of systems thinking. On a daily basis, we react to events without examining the patterns, systemic structures, or mental models that create events. Basic media literacy tends to focus on events that are in the form of a text, and then perhaps move on to identify patterns such as gender or racial stereotyping. Sometimes media literacy will go into systemic structures such as the political economy of media, but rarely will it explore mental models that lead to media problems that we so often explore. From an environmental perspective, if we examine mental models, we can see how issues like environmental degradation, patriarchy, racism, and colonialism are all intersectional and are connected to the same worldview. To work on the level of mental models and transforming them, we can guide curriculum design with an essential question. What mental models and practices will lead to a healthy media ecosystem? Backwards design starts with the essential question and then formulates approaches to answer it. These are working definitions of some key concepts that will help our approach to teaching ecomedia. First is the concept of green cultural citizenship, which is embodying sustainable behaviors and cultural practices that shape and promote ecological values within the interconnected realms of society, economy, and environment. Ecomedia literacy is perceiving how everyday ecomedia practices impact our ability to live sustainably within Earth's ecological parameters for the present and for the future. Ecomedia literacy currently has 5 intentions, although this can be revised and expanded. They are: 1. To develop an awareness of how ecomedia are physiologically interconnected with living systems. To recognize ecomedia's phenomenological influence on the perception of time, space, place, and cognition. To understand ecomedia's interdependence with the global economy and how the current model of globalization impacts living systems and social justice. To analyze how ecomedia forms symbolic associations and discourses that promote environmental ideologies. And finally, to be conscious of how ecomedia impacts our ability to engage in sustainable cultural practices and to encourage new uses of media that promote sustainability. Okay, so here's the media sphere. At first glance, this probably looks very complex, but don't worry. I will go through and methodically explore its different elements. A few things to note. Though I call it a sphere to imply that it should be thought of beyond two dimensions, I also want to emphasize its web-like characteristics. In the sense that if you touch one part of it, it affects all the other parts. I also want to emphasize that this is a heuristic. That is, it's an orienting tool to think with. The way it works is that we start with the concept of a media object, which is like a boundary object. A boundary object is something that has commonly agreed upon characteristics, but its meaning and purpose changes according to context. For example, a smartphone will have different purposes according to designers, manufacturers, users, app developers, experts, workers, and users. This is somewhat similar to the circuit of culture approach that was developed in cultural studies. A media object can be a media text, gadget, or platform, as exemplified on the right side of this slide. The sphere is divided into four lenses, which was partially inspired by Appadurai's concept of scapes. Here I identified the four main scapes and their focus. In the upper left, we have ecoculture, which is media-centric and usually involves some kind of qualitative analysis that looks at text and meanings. Here, text and discourse analysis of media text and mapping of cultural behaviors and attitudes are examined. On the upper right, we have political economy, which is a sociocentric quantitative approach, which looks at social forces. Here, the primary focus would be ideological structure of the global economic system and the political economy of media. In the lower left, you have Life World, which primarily looks at phenomenology and media ecology. Here we would explore media's sensory effect and the impact on our perception of time, space, and place that media creates. And then in the lower right section, we have the material systems point of view or perspective, which is ecology and environmental studies and material infrastructure. And this is where you would examine the material conditions of media, including extraction, production, e-waste, energy, and emissions, and also medium properties. The media sphere is also divided into two interconnected realms, as conceptualized by the socio-environmental theorists, the world system and earth system. The world system is somewhat like the superstructure of the global economy. The earth system is quite literally the physical and material characteristics of this global system. I have also mapped various different spheres that can be thought of as layers within the Ecomediasphere. And ecomedia being the mediating component between both the ethnosphere, semiosphere, and the biosphere and ecosphere. Here I have tentatively mapped some of the emerging disciplines of ecomedia studies as they plot within the different spheres. So in the top portion you see Greek cultural media studies, eco-criticism, ecomedia studies, and so forth sit somewhere in between ecoculture and political economy. Studies of effective ecology would be the life world scape, and then areas dealing with like media infrastructure, media materialism, flows, and media ecology are in the material systems, but you will see also that I put media ecology halfway in the life world because that has the material characteristics of media also impact their effect. Here I'm mapping how the media sphere roughly corresponds with the concepts of different ecologies as identified by Guattari in his 3 ecologies, although I've taken the liberty to transform them into 4 ecologies. So cultural ecology corresponds with ecoculture, political social ecology corresponds with political economy, and mental ecology corresponds with the life world, and physical ecology corresponds with material systems. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Here I want to introduce the idea of doing boundary work between the different scapes. In landscape ecology, a transition zone between 2 biomes is an ecotone, such as the zone between a field and a forest. In the media sphere, an ecomediatone is a transition area between 2 scapes. So if you look at the space between the dotted lines, you will see there are various transition zones that combine elements of the adjacent scapes. So for example, if you look up in the upper portion of the media sphere in the middle, you see that symbolic order and cultural production are closely related to each other. So therefore, they exist within the media ecotone between ecoculture and political economy. Likewise, if you move clockwise to the right, materials extraction and manufacture and production are closely related to physical ecosystems, for they involve the extraction of material resources. Moving down to the lower center area, you see that medium properties have an effect on our life world. And likewise, if we go to the ecomediatone between ecoculture and life world, we see the relationship between discourses and emotion that we find in popular culture or film as they impact us in our life world. I think a very interesting activity is to have students look at these boundaries and to debate whether or not these boundaries even make sense. This is what I would call boundary work. So how do you apply this in an actual real-world analysis? Let's take the example of Mad Max Fury Road as a media object. We can take this media object and apply an analytical perspective from the different scapes. From the ecocultural point of view, we can explore ecofeminist themes, biopolitics, eco-apocalypse, genre, identities, film language. From the political economy point of view, we can look at film as a global commodity and the industrial characteristics of film production. And you see that I put ideology somewhere between ecoculture and political economy, and also expert opinions such as those from film critics and websites. In the material systems perspective, the film as a material object and also the environmental problems associated with the production of a film can be explored. And I also put ideology between the political economy and material systems scapes because they are closely related. Finally, from the life world point of view, we can look at how spectacle influences or affects us, especially the violence and the way it's edited, or we can correspond this also to Peirce's concept of firstness. You'll see at the very bottom I put sound and image as being both in the material characteristics of the medium, but also as part of our phenomenological experience. So in doing this analysis, students can use various different analytical techniques and literacy skills, such as researching media production, which correlates with information literacy, doing analysis and deconstruction of marketing or media text, which could correlate with content analysis, semiotics, or discourse analysis. They can explore aesthetic language, as we do when we do visual or audio literacy. They can mindfully engage media environments, which is what I call ecomedia mindfulness, or also related to medium literacy. Finally, holistically inventory the ecomediasphere as a kind of systems literacy. This kind of analysis corresponds with M.C. Bateson's global responsibility model for education, in which students can create narratives of connection with digital storytelling tools such as video essays, curated blogs, pretzels, etc. They can translate concepts between media and ecology disciplines using ecological metaphors to describe media phenomena. They can perform crossovers with ways of knowing through participant observation and social learning, such as having students work in groups. And they can develop an ethical framework in order to act upon these understandings and to make wise choices. So some closing thoughts. The analysis will vary depending on the type of media object you are exploring with your students, whether it's a text or a gadget. I highly encourage you to have students debate the validity of the model. You can apply the Ecomediasphere to the structure of a course or to specific assignments. And I believe it's flexible enough to work in a variety of ecomedia subject areas. Again, I want to offer the caveat that this is still a prototype, and I would like to see this used more and get lots of feedback. I do have the concern that it's overly complex, so I'm still exploring whether or not that's the case. Now, returning to the story I started with at the beginning of this presentation, metaphorically, this approach is trying to transform the dominant mental model as symbolized by the cross by drawing a circle around it and revitalizing ancient earth knowledge for the future. And in a bit of synchronicity, it just so happens that the encircled cross is also the astronomical symbol of Earth. Okay, that's all, folks. Please send any comments or ideas to help make the Ecomediasphere better. I close by sharing with you some book covers of the various different authors and thinkers that have inspired me and that are embedded into the structure and design of the Ecomediasphere. See you online. Ciao.